Yalimadet and good evening. A very warm welcome to our live audience here at the Ismaili Centre in London, as well as everyone joining us on Ismaili TV. My name is Rahana Varani, and I work in Communications and Development at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's book launch event, which is being held in partnership with ITREB UK, and will explore the Fatimids to the Rule from Egypt, the fourth book in the IAS World of Islam series. This series aims to provide non-specialist readers with an informed and nuanced overview of the diverse manifestations of Islam. It seeks to illustrate the plurality of historical interpretations and lived expressions of Muslim societies. Our speakers this evening are Dr. Shainool Jiwa, author and historian, and Mr. Naguib Kheraj. Dr. Jiwa is an associate professor at the Institute of Ismaili Studies and has lectured and published extensively on Fatimid studies for over 3 decades. Mr. Naguib Kheraj is a member of the Board of Governors of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. He has had a long and distinguished career in the financial services sector and balances his time between commercial roles and the not-for-profit sector, where he serves on the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Finance Committee of Cambridge University. Naguib is also heavily involved at a senior level across the AKDN in a wide range of institutions around the world. The format of this evening's event will be on-stage conversation between Dr. Jiwa and Mr. Kheraj, which will highlight key facets of the Fatimids who ruled in the 10th and 12th century Mediterranean and Muslim worlds, and draw parallels with modern-day characteristics of the Ismaili Imamate institutions and the ethos and values that underpin them. Following the discussion, there will be an opportunity for the audience in the room to ask questions. It is my pleasure to now hand over to Naguib and Shainool for what promises to be a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahana. And welcome to everybody in the room and online today. And I want to start actually by thanking Shainool because it was Shainool who asked me if I would do this event with her, and I was very apprehensive about it because I've never done something like this, and it's not really in my comfort zone at all. But because it was Shainool, I said yes. And the reason I want to thank you, Shainool, is it made sure that I read this book not once but twice to make sure I was properly prepared. And so I learned an incredible amount. And because I was so captivated by this book, and I read the second book before the first book in the series, I then read the first book in the series. So I now feel like I know a little bit about Fatimid history, and I'm really pleased that this forced me to do that in a way that I probably wouldn't have done it if I wasn't involved in this event today. So thank you for that. And I want to start by asking you 2 questions, really. In the introduction, we heard that you're a historian, and a lot of what IAS has done is to publish history. And I want to ask you to explain to us why history is important, and why is this particular period in history so important?
Yes, well, first of all, may I say how delighted I am that you did accept. And I have Nina to thank because I didn't quite have the heart to ask you directly. So I floated the idea with Nina and said, what do you think? And then the result is that we are sitting here today. So thank you. Why is history important? History is important because it really is a blueprint of who we are. And for a faith tradition such as ours that claims to have a 1400-year period of continuous history of the imamate, for example, it is not just simply about the events and the personalities. It is also about our values, about who we are, about how we view the world. It's the way we live in the world. And so in understanding history, we really understand, in that sense, our DNA, and it impacts how we then also see our future and how we prepare our young for the future. So in that sense, history is really critical. It's also critical, I think, particularly for us as Ismailis, because as you will well remember, Naguib, with the establishment of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, when Maulana Hazri Imam sent that founding talika about the institute, he had said, not since the Fatimid period do we have an institution where we study our own history, our own heritage, our own literature, our own philosophy by our own efforts and through our own sources. Of course, I'm completely paraphrasing what he said. But that, I think, has been really salient because in the way history has been written, our history has been written, it has often been written by others. And so how do we find ways of understanding ourselves in ways that are authentic, but are rooted in sources, but also have a way of presenting our story, as it were? And that's where the work of the Institute has been really critical in establishing that bedrock. And for this particular period of history, we are extremely fortunate in that we have so many sources, because of course the Imams were at the center stage of their world. And so all these reasons mean that studying this particular period, the Fatimid period, is extremely rich and varied because of the reasons I mentioned.
Good. Well, I think if you go back to the earlier period in IS's history, I remember Hazrat talking a lot nearly 30 years ago about wanting to make sure that there were authoritative sources about Ismaili history. So there were not so many sources, and many of the important texts that existed had never been translated into other languages, and so that was always a big focus for him.
Yes.
And I always wondered, actually, for many years, why does he keep referring to the Fatimid period? And if you go back and read the farmans that he's made, he makes many, many references to Fatimid times.
Yes.
Even as you say, in the founding talika for IIS, he referred to that period. And I remember sitting in meetings for many years hearing him talk about the development of the Al-Azhar Park in Cairo. And me being not very educated in Ismaili history, I didn't quite understand why were we spending so much money and so much effort to develop this park, until I then understood the importance of the Fatimid period. And I think when you read this book, these two books, you really understand the scale and the scope and the impact in that period. And we're going to go on to talk about many other aspects of that period that help us understand why it was so important.
Yeah.
But
Sorry. And before I do that, just building on what you were saying about, excuse me, Hazrat Imam's firmans, it's very interesting, at least to me, when he refers to this period, it isn't about the fact that this was a vast empire and all the rest of it. He often focuses on the attitudes and values that were prevalent at that time, that are very significant precursors of attitudes for our time. And he's talked about the role of intellect being paramount, relations between Muslims among themselves as well as among other non-Muslim communities whom they live being warm and cordial. So I find that in speaking about that period, the Imam often also reminds us of these values, these attitudes, that he also sees as being very much a part of who we are today. And so in talking about why was this empire the way it was and what led to it becoming that, it's very interesting that when this empire started, it comes after a 150-year period of what in Ismaili history comes to be called the Dor al-Satar, the period of concealment, where even the whereabouts of the imams, the names of the imams, none of this was known. And that's because the persecution of the dynasty that was ruling over the Muslim world at the time, called the Abbasids, was so severe that the very life of the Imam was constantly in danger. And yet, when in that 150-year period, you find that while the identity of the Imams were deliberately camouflaged and kept secret for his safety, in fact, the whole Ismaili dawah, and by dawah what I mean is this mission of those who had taken on the work of the imamate in terms of promoting it, in terms of teaching others. So those who were teachers, they were emissaries, what we would maybe call vaizin today, or people who teach about the faith, teachers, etc. They then became very significant in spreading the word about the imamate across all areas, all major areas of the Muslim world. And so what happens is that because you have this dawah flourishing across these different parts of the world, there is a great awareness and a keenness to actually restore the rule of what were called the Ahl al-Bayt, those who are the descendants of the Prophet. And of course, the Imams were seen as direct descendants of the Prophet. And so in all of that, when the Imam finally is pronounced in North Africa in 909, what you find is that he doesn't just claim the Ismaili imamate, or makes that public. He actually says that it pronounces that he is in fact the Amir al-Mu'minin. He is the true caliph over the Muslimin, over the entire Muslim empire. And in doing that, the responsibility that the imams take on are not just simply for those who have given him allegiance as his murids. It is for all these people, under all these territories that they come to rule, that they now become the shepherd, the guardian, right? So, and in doing that, they adopt the model that the Prophet Muhammad had adopted when he came from Mecca to Medina and established the first Islamic state. So they see themselves as modeling the model of governance, etc., of the Prophet, whom they often referred to as Jadduna, our grandfather.
But if I can just go back to
Sure.
this question of statehood.
Yes.
Why was it important to have, in effect, our own state
Yes.
led by the imams, as opposed to just having some sort of loose area? And why did it need to be so big? Mm-hmm. So what I was trying to understand is, was this about empire building and power, or was there some other motivation for it?
So it was both, but it was driven by this aspiration that the dawah was working towards al-haq, the truth. So it was called the dawatul haq, dawatul hadiyah, the rightly guided dawah. And the aim was that when the state can be established, there is enough political stability that this version of governance, this view of the Ahl al-Bayt then governing as the righteous heads of the state, could be actualized. It couldn't be actualized simply in these secret dawah gatherings, that because remember the Abbasids had already been ruling, and they first came to power in 765 CE at the death of, they came to power in 750 CE, 15 years after which Imam Jafar as-Sadiq passes away, right? So from that time up until 909, when Imam al-Mahdi establishes himself in North Africa, which is a century and a half, the Ismailis have to live in great danger because of the circumstances.
So this was really about creating a safe
space,
place.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's what was the underlying motive.
The other thing that I found confusing when you think about the spread here, and you talked about the fact that the Caliph was the Caliph for all people, Ismailis and non-Ismailis, and you talked about the missionaries. Mm-hmm. Tell me about whether this was a process of mass conversion. Was that the driver of this, or was that not really the driver of it? And if it was about mass conversion, how did they end up without everybody being forcibly converted?
Yes, it's a really good question, absolutely. And it's very interesting because when the Fatimids established themselves in North Africa, and of course over a period of 60 years, their rule extends all the way from Algeria right up into Egypt eventually in 969. So within 60 years, they have really expanded their empire, as it were, and then of course parts of Syria, Yemen, etc. So they have a very, and Mecca, Medina, which I'll talk about in a minute. What you find is that in doing this, in the lands that they establish their rule, their dawah, of course, functions and is protected and is in fact given all the amenities now to flourish. But the proselytization, as it were, is minimum. So nobody is expected to convert or join the Ismaili faith unless they choose to do so. However, outside the Fatimid lands, the active proselytization carries on, which means that even though the Fatimids altogether reign for over 200 years, Ismailis remain a minority within the Fatimid state, because that's not the priority, that's not the ambition. And if I may, I know you want to move on to the next question.
But actually, this is a really important point, because there's a sort of almost implicit assumption that many of us make, including me, which was that the Fatimid state was equal to an Ismaili state, and everybody in that rule was Ismaili, and that's not true at all.
Not true at all.
Right.
Not only is it not true at all, in fact, if you allow me, let me give you another example. So if we look at Iran, Iran has historically always been majority Sunni, okay, up until the 15th century. Right? In the 15th, 16th century, you have the Safavids who established themselves as rulers of Iran. Within 2 centuries, Iran becomes majority Shia. Because if you wanted to be involved in any way in the state, in administration, in judiciary, etc., it was helpful to be Shia. Right? Whereas under the Fatimids, you find that absolutely doesn't happen. And in fact, all roles, all major roles in the administration, in governance, in the judiciary were open to anyone who had the competency to take on that role. They didn't have to be Ismaili, they didn't even have to be Muslim. So you had a vizier, the chief minister in Egypt, Isa bin Nestorius, the very name, right? Isa who was from the Nestorian Christian background, as the vizier. The very first vizier in Fatimid Egypt was called Yaqub bin Kilis, who was formerly a Jew. Then he converted to Islam, and then he became an Ismaili. So, because he chose to. So what I'm saying is that it was the idea of what we might today call meritocracy and competence being the criteria is certainly something that you can see in the way that underpin the values. Obviously, these terms like meritocracy and pluralism, and these are all obviously modern terms, so you wouldn't use them in that way, but it's the ethic underlying
just
it.
on this question of values, so going back to the creation of this empire, in the book you provide a sort of almost graphic explanation of the battles that took place to establish the beginning of the state. What I didn't get from the rest of the book was how much of the rest of the spread required that sort of brutal war and conquest, and how much of it then just fell into place because people wanted to follow. And when you look at the brutalism and the violence that was involved, it's quite juxtaposition with, in the book you talk about how there was execution as was part of punishment for bad crimes, but one of the Imam Caliphs said as somebody was being executed that we should pray for the person and have mercy on him.
Absolutely.
So I was struggling with this idea that you should have mercy on a murderer when you're executing them, and yet you could have all this kind of fierce battle and kill all these people. So just talk to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So what I invite people to do is read book 1, where this whole incident of Dai Abu Abdullah Shi, who is the founding Dai of the Fatimid Dawa in North Africa, has then to be has to be executed because of treason. And because he has committed treason against the caliph and the state, he now has to be executed. But the Imam not only said we have to pray over him, he led his janazah prayer. He led his funeral prayer himself. So you see these instances of how that happens. And you're absolutely right that when they first arrive in North Africa to establish their power, there is warfare. There is no doubt about it. And that's the way of the world 1,000 years ago, and no different today in some ways. But what you find is that when the Fatimids arrive in Egypt, which is 60 years later, it's a very different story, because the chief Dai in Egypt has already worked with the key stakeholders in Egypt to ensure that the safety mechanisms have been ensured, that power is transferred smoothly. And so what happens is that, in fact, these key dignitaries of Egypt from different backgrounds actually write to Imam al-Mu'izz, who is by that time ruling in North Africa. He's our 4th Fatimid Imam Caliph and 14th Imam, Ismaili Imam. They write to him inviting him to come to Egypt. You then have this spectacle of this vast army, which the sources talk about as being over 100,000 soldiers, which means lots and lots and lots. Doesn't necessarily mean that many, exact number. But they march all the way from North Africa to Egypt, from Mahdiya and Mansuriya into Egypt. But it's a ceremonial entrance, effectively. There are minor skirmishes here and there because the dawah and the diplomacy have already done their work. And a quick example, 15 years before Imam Mu'izz actually arrives in Egypt, coins have already been minted in his name and circulated in Egypt. Banners have been distributed. So you see, it's a very different way of arriving into Egypt than it was in the way they had to start off 60 years previously.
And it's interesting when you look at the parallels to today and you ask the question about this notion of needing statehood in order to be free to practice your faith without the risk of persecution. So in many parts of the world today where the Jamaat lives, that isn't really a problem, but in some parts it still is a problem.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting if you go back to one of the questions many people ask is, why was IS set up in London as opposed to in a country which was a Muslim majority country or where the Jamaat was much bigger? In 1977, the Jamaat in London was pretty small. And the primary reason was because Hazrat Imam said, I want this to be in a place where there would be freedom to research and publish that was not subject to state censorism or control or other religious authorities in the country dictating what we can and can't research and what we can and can't publish. That isn't the case everywhere in the world today, where there is censorship and difficulty publishing on subjects to do with religion, but not in this country in that way, which is the reason why IS was set up here rather than elsewhere. And when you go back to this history of statehood and empire and officialdom of the imams as caliphs, and you think about what has Hazrat Imam been doing over the last 25 years with all these diplomatic accords for the AKDN and the Ismaili Imamate, what is the recognition in Portugal of the Ismaili Imamate as an institution as opposed to the recognition of the individual? That's very much along the same lines. It's about establishing an umbrella and a protectorate for the Jamaat. So the purpose of these accords and these representatives is to protect the safety of the Jamaat, the safety of our institutions, the sanctity of our assets from being sequestered. And people ask the question often, why are so many of our institutions domiciled legally in Switzerland? So Aga Khan Foundation and all the other major apex institutions were set up in Switzerland because Hazrat Imam said that was the safest neutral place to have the legal domicile and to have assets owned in, because in an uncertain world in other countries, having things owned under a Swiss umbrella had a degree of safety for the Imam and for the Jamaat. And these principles are really no different. And what you were talking about in terms of pluralism, you know, we hear Hazrat Imam talk a lot about pluralism and about the importance of living comfortably with people of many different faiths and ethnicities and backgrounds. And this is exactly what you had, as you were describing, of Jews and Christians and different varieties of Christians and different varieties of Muslim believers, all coexisting perfectly peacefully for several hundred years. So a lot of lessons in all of that. And I think this question of pluralism comes up in the book where you talk about this declaration of Aman, which I think is a really interesting principle. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So again, if we pick up the story from where I had brought it in terms of the arrival of the Fatimids into Egypt. Now you see, Egypt is a very interesting country. It was known as the breadbasket of the region. We knew right from time immemorial, actually, and we know that it was from Egypt that grain used to go to Syria, also to Hijaz, which is where Mecca and Medina are, to Jerusalem and that whole area. So Egypt was seen very much as the heartland of the Muslim world at the time. And the fact that the Fatimids were now coming over and taking over in Egypt was also very significant from a political point of view, because up until that time, you had always had Egypt directly under the influence of Syria, which, if those of us who remember our history will remember the Umayyads, who ruled before the Abbasids. And it was the Umayyads, and it was the first Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah, who had directly clashed with Imam Ali in terms of establishing his own empire, his own dynasty. And so you found that in Egypt there was a very strong Sunni pro-Umayyad sentiment right through this period. And so when the Fatimids arrive in Egypt, they do something very interesting and different. When you were talking about this idea of protectorate and ensuring that things were safe for the community, it reminded me of a term that the Fatimids use called the dhimma. Dhimma is a Quranic term, and it means protection. And in the South Asian Ismaili tradition, we have a very similar word called chhatra chaya. This idea of chhatra chaya of the Imam. It's the same word. It's the same, not the same word etymologically, but it has the same meaning. And so when Prophet Muhammad first comes to Mecca, from Mecca to Medina and establishes the state, he ensures that everyone who is in Medina, most of whom were not Muslim, of course, they were Jews, they were Christians, they were idol worshippers, etc. The Muslims were a minority, were all under the dhimma, under the protection of the Prophet. And the Imams take on exactly that same idea and principle. So when they come, before the Imam comes into Egypt, his commander, Jawhar Sikili, issues this Aman document. And in that, it guarantees the peace and safety and upkeep and livelihood of every single person in the country, regardless of their ethnic background, regardless of their religious background. And they also confirm in there, or commit in there, that in fact Muslims of different Sunni persuasions could continue to not only attend their mosques and continue to practice their practices, so could the Jews of different denominations, so could the Christians, as could the Ismailis. So they allowed for this multiplicity of faith and its practice in that way, and they ensured its safety. They also ensured that on matters of personal law, family law, which is where most of the cases occur around inheritance, around divorce, etc., etc. On all these matters, Muslims of each denomination could be judged according to their own tradition, right? And Jews could be, and Christians could be according to theirs. And so you find that in the way that the Fatimids create the paradigm of governance in Egypt, it allows for this inclusiveness and acceptance of these diversity of traditions and enriching from them in terms of their then contribution into the state and society. So they benefit from the largest pool of competence as well.
So we have the same experience today when people ask the question, why do our AKDN institutions do so much for people who are non-Ismaili? This is the background to that, and it's just a continuation of the same kind of principle. And you were talking there about the justice system and the way rights were protected. And again, if you look at our arbitration boards and the way in which arbitration is embedded in the way our community social governance operates, it's along the same principles. So there's many things that we can see that that come from that period. So you were talking about faith and practice. So the Ismailis were a minority, and what I wasn't clear about is how did they practice their faith? Because there's references to Ismailis going to offer prayers with other Muslims in the mosques, but there were also Jamaat Khanas, right?
No.
So
So
explain
there weren't
that to
Jamaat
us.
Khanas, but what there were, so Ismailis being Shia prayed in Shia mosques. So, you know, the Azhar Mosque, the Akmar Mosque, the Anwar Mosque, all these major Fatimid mosques that we talk about even today. Notice their names, right? Azhar, which is obviously connected to the female of that, the feminine of that is Zahra. So Fatimat is Zahra, Azhar, right? Again, luminous. Anwar, same thing from Nur. Akmar, moonlight. So you find that these mosques, they were Shia mosques, and the Shia Adhan was pronounced. And so the Ismailis prayed with their Shia brothers and sisters, because women went too, in these mosques. However, that's not the only thing they did. So they had the Salat, was their prayer with other Shia. They also had what were called Majalis al-Hikmah. In this Majalis al-Hikmah, Majlis, which we all know of as a word, Majlis, plural Majalis, Majalis al-Hikmah, Hikmat, that we know of as well, represented the teachings and knowledge of the Imams and of the Prophet, etc. So those Majalis al-Hikmah were private gatherings. Only those who had given allegiance to the Imam as the Imam Zaman would attend. And what we call Bayah today, it was called Ahad at the time. And so those who had given their Ahad as Ismailis, they would also go to this majalis and do their offerings, give their offerings. They would receive tabarruk, they would receive barakah from the Imam, what we call jura. They would receive tabarruk from the Imam in that way, etc. So there were, Ismailis had public spaces of prayer and worship, and they also had private spaces where, when they were practicing their particular tariqah practices, they had their own spaces. And these were held at the Imam's palace, they were held in mosques at different times, so there were several venues in which this could be held. And women, they had majalis for women as well. Right from the get-go, when the Fatimid Dawa first starts its work in North Africa, there were already majalis that were there for women as well.
So on that subject of women and interfaith interaction, two things that I thought were quite interesting that come up in the book. So tell us about interfaith marriages and families. So the Ismailis were a minority, but they were embedded in the broader community. And the Imams themselves married people who were local. So in a sense, the ethnicity which had come from different lands got mixed with the ethnicity of North Africa.
Absolutely, and Egypt. So if I can give you an example, Imams Al-Mahdi and Al-Qaim, the first two Fatimid Imam caliphs, were both of Arab origin, born from Arab mothers, etc. Imam Mansur, our third Fatimid Imam caliph, his mother was a Berber lady. Right? The Imam Aziz, our fifth Fatimid Imam Caliph, had a mother who had Slav features. She had, very fair features. So in fact, in the sources, we have a striking description of Imam Aziz with blue eyes and auburn hair and broad-shouldered, and because he clearly was, looked different to.
Right.
So you find, and then again in Imam Mustansibilla's time, Imam Mustansibilla's mother was a Sudanese lady. So you find that, the imams, of course, marry from that vast pool of the populace.
And in the book, you talk a lot about the matriarchal figures in the imams' family. So we had imams who were very young, where the mothers were very influential. Tell us about how women were involved in business and academia and the civil administration. Was there a kind of ability for women to be in important positions?
To some extent, yes, particularly in the dawah, but not so much in the state, as it were. So you find a figure like Sitt al-Mulk, who is the darling daughter of Imam al-Aziz, to whom he actually gives a palace dedicated to her to live in, etc. She was a lady who had several major enterprises, both in terms of commercial as well as public works, etc. Many of these women did in their own ways, but Sitt al-Mulk was particularly exceptional in that way. So while you had those kinds of roles being performed, in the dawah we have a far greater ability for women to rise to more senior levels. So if I can give you an example of, just one example, because I know time is rushing on. We have this lady called Sayyida Arwa, who was appointed by Imam al-Mustansir as the chief da'i of Yemen and India. And she played a critical role in ensuring that the corpus of Fatimid scholarship and knowledge, for which the Fatimids were well known in the world at the time, that entire corpus, the copies of that were made when things were getting quite rough and tumble in Egypt at the court itself in Imam Mustansibilla's time, and ensured that they were taken to Yemen, and from Yemen they were then taken for safekeeping to India. So today, when we talk about the collections of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, a lot of our manuscript collections come to us from that route.
Right. Interesting. So you referenced Al-Azhar Mosque, but you didn't talk about Al-Azhar University.
Yes.
And academia was a really important part of the Fatimid legacy.
Yes.
Tell us about the nature of that, because I think people tend to associate Al-Azhar with our modern day interpretation as it being a theological school, but there were also academic institutions at that time that were leading places in fields of philosophy and science and all manner of other things.
Absolutely. So it's very interesting. Again, you see, if we remember the paradigm of the Prophet as the model, okay? So just as the first mosque in Medina was a community center where they prayed together, they studied there, they had diplomatic missions there, all sorts of things happened there. The Azhar is established as a mosque, and it's the two buildings when Jauhar first arrives in Egypt, he establishes are the Azhar and the Imam's Palace in Cairo itself, of course. That happens, and within 35 years of its foundation as a mosque, it also becomes a center of learning. So, within not 35, within a decade of its existence, in the time of Imam al-Aziz Billah. Because what happens is that 35 scholars are housed near the Azhar to teach in between prayer times. Now, they teach the religious sciences, all the religious subjects. In the time of Imam al-Hakim, you have what is called the Dar al-Hikmah, that is established, which is a center of learning where all the known sciences, what we call the natural sciences, were taught. Astronomy, physics, economics, linguistics, grammar, all these were taught. And there, it wasn't just Ismailis, of course, who taught, or only Muslims who taught. Scholars of all kinds of backgrounds taught there.
And came from around the world.
They absolutely came from around the world. And if you let me make one point, you see, we often think about this whole heritage, the heritage, the Greek heritage, and the Latin heritage that the West sees itself, heir to. Where we know that all of that, first of all, got translated in Muslim lands, in Baghdad. They got transmitted into Cairo. From Cairo, they went to Cordoba and Seville and entered into Cambridge, etc., Oxford, and moved further. So the Fatimids are part of that whole story of this transmission of knowledge, of human knowledge at the time, in this way.
And all sponsored by the Imam Caliphs, who paid for the scholars.
Absolutely,
right?
And had an endowment for it.
Well, that I thought was fascinating, actually. We think today about these big university endowments that you read about that create income for academic institutions. But these guys, 1,000 years ago, were already doing that. So they set up a model where there were properties owned, and the income of the rent of the properties was what was used to pay for the costs of the academic institution. So people think of today's endowment model of universities as being a recent phenomenon. It's not at all. It dates all the way back to there. So last subject before we close today, you've been running these tours and visits that have been very popular. Hard to get on them. You've done it, I think, twice in Tunisia. Tell us about what there is to go and see today. So, if you wanted to see some of this history, where would you go and what would you see?
So Tunisia is very interesting. We are all very clued on about Cairo, of course, founded by the Imams. In fact, the very name, Al-Qahira, which is the Arabic name for Cairo, that's his shortened name. Its full name is Al-Qahira Al-Muiziyah, the victorious city of Al-Muiz. And even today, if you walk at the main thoroughfare across from the Azhar Park, the street today is still called Sharia Al-Muiz Lidinallah, the street of Al-Muiz Lidinallah. So there is a lot of that actual history and heritage and architecture in Cairo. But the very first purpose-built city that the Fatimids built was Al-Mahdiyah, of course, and that's in Tunisia. And to this day, you go to Tunisia and you walk what's called the Old City. The very gate through which you enter was built in Fatimid times, and it is so solidly built that it has withstood centuries of time. And as soon as you walk in there, you walk along streets that are named by the names of the imams, the names of the dais, generals. So you are literally walking in the footsteps of the Fatimids, which is why we call the course such a long name, walking in the footsteps of the Fatimids, because that's what we do. And as we do that, we then obviously learn about our history and heritage. But you have been to Cairo, so tell us about that.
Well, I would thoroughly recommend, if you ever have the chance to visit Cairo, to go to Cairo. It's a fascinating place in broader historical context with the pyramids and the museum. In fact, many people wouldn't know that the museum in Cairo gets more, well, it certainly did before COVID, get more visitors than the Louvre or the British Museum. The museum in Cairo received pre-COVID 12 million visitors a year. It's the most visited museum in the world. But the Al-Azhar Park was a revelation for me, having heard Hazrat Imam talk about it a lot over many years and seen the photos. Actually going there and seeing the real thing was just spectacular. And 2 million people a year go to that park. You have to pay to go in. So if you think about that in a local context, it is a hugely impactful place and quite beautiful. And the surrounding area is a wonderful example of holistic development work. So it was a very poor neighborhood, and the whole neighborhood has been uplifted by the impact of the park. There's artisans who are working there who've been retrained in traditional crafts. They've put in early childhood development centers, there's health clinics. The whole area has had a major, major lift. And talking about pluralism, one of the things you find when you go to the park is when they were building the park, they discovered the remains of this part of the Ayyubid wall. So Azimam stopped the whole project in order to properly excavate and preserve the remains of this wall of the people who were the people who took out the Fatimids. So as a lesson in respecting other groups or other people who may have been your opponents and honoring them, it's a fantastic example. So well worth going to visit if you ever have the chance. And I think this year
too.
we're doing it this year in Cairo, right?
We've run two before in Cairo as well. So we are running one this year as well.
But I think you only have 40 spots or something.
Yeah, they're
those,
very
right?
tight.
So when they get announced, the spots go very fast,
very
and it's
quickly.
first come, first served. So
we're also doing one in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania this year. Again, looking at this whole East African heritage and history, and launching our second Living Ismaili Traditions book there, which is about the East African story of the Ismailis. Little plug for the series.
So Shainool, thank you for bringing the book alive for us.
Shainool and Naguib, thank you both for a truly delightful and engaging discussion of the book. Your insights and perspectives have undoubtedly enriched our understanding of this work.
It's my honor to offer a few thank yous before we close this evening. Firstly, Shainool, tonight you've not only helped us deepen our understanding of the Fatimids from their newly founded capital of Cairo, but have provided us with a complete history over the two books, Fatimids 1 and 2, of the 2 centuries of their presence in Egypt. It is very clear that you're very passionate about this period of our history, and you clearly are a thought leader in this area. And for me, it has really reignited that fascination with the Fatimid Empire, and I think I'm going to take you up on a few of those spots. Naguib, thank you for facilitating such an engaging conversation. It was very insightful to hear about the vision behind these accessible publications, and moreover, the shared mandate of the IIS, and how that's steeped actually from history and how it's still relevant for us today. Thank you to all our volunteers for your contributions in making this event a success. I would like to thank you all once again for joining us today, either here at the Ismaili Centre in London or virtually on Ismaili TV, and showing your support for Dr. Shainool, Jiwa and the work of the IIS. We hope that you have enjoyed this very insightful event. Thank you. Ya Ali Madad and Khidafis.